and welcome. Watchbox Studios, I am Michael Michaels, I'm the host of Watch Science. And tonight we have a very special show. I have a very good friend of mine, Mr. Chris Kraska. Chris, welcome.
Pleasure to be here.
And we are going to be talking about diving, dive watches, bronze watches, the history of dive watches from a diver's perspective of it, and not just, you know, people throwing them on a wrist, but people that actually use the watches. Chris has a very good background, both in diving, being a dive master, being an underwater archaeologist, photographer for watch brands. So we're going to touch on a lot of that different stuff and the different watches. The history of dive watches that a lot of people probably don't know about and how it started. What I want to do first is I want to do a follow-up of the show a couple weeks ago. We talked about timing, and I get a lot of great feedback from the timing episode. It was great doing a hands-on, and I thank everybody for the camera work because you guys just did a great job. One thing I didn't get to touch on I had questions about was isochronism, and I know I mentioned it during the show, but we never really got to demonstrate it, exactly being able to show it live. What it is. So if we can just get a cutaway to the time machine, and we're going to try demonstrating this real quick. And right now we have our 2892, and again the different readings we're looking at seconds per day. We're averaging 3 to 4 seconds a day negative, 290 degrees amplitude, and this is what we're going to keep an eye on, are the two here, both the rate and the amplitude. This watch is at full power. I'm going to go ahead and give it just a little more juice. I'll just kick it up just a little bit here. And try to get a little more rate out of it. A little flatter of a line, and there we go. It's coming up just a hair. Try to just so we can get a good baseline here. Now, when we talk about isochronism, our balance wheel is, if we can get a cutaway to the movement here, we see our balance wheel, it's oscillating right now in the flat position at 290 degrees. So it's basically making a 290 degree rotation. We can't go to 360 degrees because we'll overbank, and the banking pin will actually come back and start hitting the forks. So we can't have that. So we want to keep this amplitude right around 300 degrees. ETA 300 to 310. Rolex is about 270, 290. But what we're going to do is, this is at full power. So we're looking at this watch full power right now. And again, in a flat position, because it's just going to be easier for me to actually work on the watch. In a flat position, we are going to stabilize at right around 0. But it's going to be a very high amplitude at the 290 degrees. What I need to demonstrate, though, is I'm actually going to let the power down off of this. Very carefully let the power down. Bring the power back up a little bit. And as I bring that power up, amplitude is going to drop off. It's really going to drop off. But our rate is going to stay virtually the same. And if you do a cutaway to the time machine right now, we can show this. We're running at about 200 degrees. We're at 15, and we have almost no power on this watch right now. So I'm going to bring just a little more power up on it and try to get it to roughly half wind, which is on this is about 12 turns. The little mountains you see right there, that's the microphone. That's the input to the microphone when I'm actually winding the watch. So I'm going to give it a little more power. We'll get about 220, which is about half power on this watch, actually 220 to 240. And we're going to see the rate's not going to change that much. It's going to drop, but it's not going to drop drastically. So how is this possible? We have the same rate, but we don't have the same rotation. So when the amplitude drops, the balance wheel is actually, the release of the balance of the power is actually faster than when it's at full power. When you have full power, the balance wheel is snapping back very fast at a long motion. Right now, we're actually at a slower motion, but it's actually chattering faster. So that is, in an easier, simpler sense, that's isochronism, and it's we want the watch to be accurate from full power to half power to when you put that watch back on again, because what's going to happen is you take that watch off, you don't wear it overnight, you pick it up, and you still want it to be relatively on time. So that's our quick little watch science part we talked about. The other thing I wanted to talk about we had questions about timing, free sprung balances. And I brought down a couple different keys, and these are Omega specific keys. And this is for the 8500 on top, and this is for the 2500 and 3313s. And what they are, they're a little different. They're microstella style, but if you can get in here and see right here, this little star, that is what is the little nut right here. And so it's showing you which one it is. And this is the microstella, okay? And this is the microstella that's used on the 8500. Conversely, this is it's a square that's used on the 2500 and the 3313, and this also, coincidentally, this is also used on the Panerai. So, and the way you work it is, you have little graduations here. You put it on the nut, and you actually turn it, and you can see through the top where how many graduations are turning it. And at a later episode, I'd be glad to bring in a movement and actually demonstrate how this works. But I just wanted to give everybody a little brief because I had a lot of questions on that. So with that, I want to welcome Chris.
Thanks.
And
cheers.
Cheers. Thank you, doers. And Chris, how'd you get started in diving?
Actually, I've only been diving for 12 years now. Mm-hmm. You know, I grew up in South Florida, so oddly enough, I didn't dive in South Florida. My parents weren't particularly wealthy. We didn't have a whole lot of money. I had friends that were diving and doing a lot of water sports, not me. So I moved to Ohio in '99, and
that's where we met.
That's where we met, in Ohio, and I think you buggered one of the watches that I had given you.
Yeah. Many years ago.
Many years ago. And I actually got interested in diving. It was something I always wanted to do, and I always thought it was really, really expensive, and it turned out not to be. And once I dove the first couple times, I was hooked.
Yeah, that's what I hear. I've snorkeled. I never got certified on it. You always tried to get me to get certified. And for one reason or another, when I was living in St. Thomas, just never got around to it.
And you keep coming down to the Keys, so you probably should get certified one day.
Yes, I think I'll do that.
You should.
So some of the things you've done, let's talk first about some of the watches.
Okay.
And we mentioned Omega, where you love the Omega. And this is just a little snippet of some of the pieces. Vintage Omega dive watches, something like what I'm wearing right now. Mm-hmm. If I could do a quick wrist check.
I need to do one too for my wife, actually.
And there we are. And if you want to throw it up, there's
my, let's see if we can get it that way.
A Turnomatic.
That's my
and
Turnomatic.
We're pretty sure I worked on that watch 10 years ago.
Kontiki that my wife gave me. She said it's the only watch she will ever buy for me because she will never buy one again. I love the watch. But
Again, vintage watches, we both have a strong attraction to vintage watches, the history they tell, everything else. Let's touch briefly on the Omega. This was the part of your collection of vintage Omega watches. So if we could bring that up real quick. And this is just a few of the pieces. Everything in here, I've been familiar with these. The one that really catches my attention, though, is right here.
The 1,000 meter.
The 1,000 meter. And I think yours is probably the only one of these that I can remember seeing. It's not a common piece.
Yeah, they're like hen's teeth now. I mean, it used to be that one or two of them came up for sale every couple months back in the early 2000s, but I have not seen one in probably 3 or 4 years. I haven't looked for them, but I just haven't seen
one. Like I said, I can't remember. I see a lot of watches cross the bench. I see a lot of watches come through the store. That's one of them that I just can't remember, putting my hands on in the last 10 years.
Yeah, and it was essentially an improvement on the Ploprof, the 610 meter, I believe.
Yeah. Very, very cool design, though. It almost has that same Flightmaster design.
Yeah, the case is very similar to the Flightmaster.
Very cool pieces, though.
Left-hand crown.
Left-hand crown. Is that powered also by the 1020?
I believe it was, but don't quote me on it.
Okay. Yeah, if it around the same area, it probably was. Mm-hmm. Cool piece, has the same bezel design and everything. What I love about the Ploprof is the lock on it, though.
Yep.
Where it just has that definitive lock. We go. I also wanted to talk about, as we get into dive watches, talk to us about the first waterproof watches, water-resistant watches. It wasn't a wristwatch, was it?
No, actually, the first watches that were designated as truly dustproof, waterproof, it was kind of a big push in the mid-1800s. The earliest one on record that I've read about and doing a little bit of research was actually exhibited at the London Grand Exhibition in 1851 by a couple of watchmakers. I believe they were named Petite and Trappet. And they actually displayed this watch in a glass bowl filled with water, suspended, working, obviously running, surrounded by goldfish. Not a whole lot is known about the watch, how many were produced. I don't think there's even any examples around anymore. But that was the first watch that was billed as being waterproof, water resistant. There were some patents in the later 1800s. In fact, the screw-down crown was first patented in 1871, I believe, by Ezra Fitch. Now, the problem with his screw-down crown was it screwed to the left, so there was no clutch in it.
Okay.
So as you wound the watch, if you wound it all the way, and then you decided you needed to set the watch, you were out of luck.
Okay.
Because you had already wound it all the way, you would be unable to pull the crown out and move the hand.
Understood, yeah.
And then a gentleman by the name of, I believe it was Aaron Twing, the same year patented a screw-down clutch, a screw-down crown with a clutch.
Which actually disengages as you screw it down, and that's one of the things. If you ever, when you unscrew your Rolex crown, today, that's what we're talking about, where the crown actually pops apart.
Yep.
And so when it screws into the case, it disengages, so you can actually screw it down, and you're not winding the watch anymore. It's not as important on an automatic watch when you're talking about manual wind watches that come to a definitive end when you're at the mainspring. You physically can't turn it anymore. If you try to force it, you're going to break the mainspring.
Yeah. And I mean, there were several other developments in waterproof watches after that. You had the Bourgeois case, I believe, in the late 19-teens, which was fairly waterproof. They've actually tested some of the ones that are still around. Waterproof in a bowl of water or in a sink or whatever for an extended period of time. You had the submarine watches that were actually commissioned, I believe, for the British Navy by some officers that were fairly waterproof. They didn't have a screw-down crown, but they had a rubber gasket they essentially pushed into. Those were fairly waterproof. And then, of course, everyone knows the Rolex Oyster case.
Yep.
I believe 1927 was when Rolex debuted it. Interestingly enough, they also exhibited it in a fishbowl, essentially, suspended in water, just as Trappet and Petite had done in 1851.
That would be interesting to know if they got that idea, or if that was just a brainstorm of Mr. Wilsdorf.
It'd be interesting to know.
Just to know. That's probably just lost. Who knows? Who knows if it's possible to figure that out.
Yep.
But one of the things, I used to work on a lot of the old Rolex. I used to see a lot of the old pieces. And the one thing I remember is all the gaskets were lead. So when did do you know when they started using the rubber? Before
they were lead, they were leather.
Okay, that makes sense.
Which is not a good thing to make dive watch or waterproof watch gaskets out of. It deteriorates really quickly. I am not 100% sure. I know that I believe the Rolex Oyster case used metal-to-metal fit.
I know it had lead because I've taken some of those apart on the old bubble backs.
Well, lead would be metal. I was thinking.
And they actually had a lead gasket in there, and you'd have to peel that lead gasket out. Actually, I think at home I even have a box of old lead gaskets.
Okay.
Of vintage gaskets that I wouldn't even in a restoration, I probably wouldn't use just because it's not reliable enough.
Right.
It's a strange feel when you screw down a watch case back and it has a lead gasket.
It probably sinks in a little bit. There's some give.
It's a little bit. It's a different give than butyl rubber has.
Interesting. I was going to mention the first watch specifically designed and marketed for diving was the Omega Marine in 1932. And so Omega kind of bypassed the need to use Rolex's patent or design by creating a case within a case. Okay. So they actually had the movement, the crown, the whole 9 yards that would slip inside and seal at the top into the outer case, which was a waterproof case.
Okay, was that a wristwatch or was that a wearable watch?
That was a wristwatch. It was wearable. I believe it was worn in 1936. It was certified to something like 90 meters on 3 dives, which in 1932 is pretty incredible.
That's pretty amazing.
Pretty amazing.
It's pretty amazing anyone can go that deep in 1932.
Exactly. They probably shouldn't have, but they did.
Yeah, exactly. Some of the other things, let's talk about you for a minute, and some of the things you did. You are a diver. You've taken some photographs for watch brands.
I have.
And let's see if we can pull some of these up. And right here, this is a bronze case, isn't it?
That's a bronze case. That's Aquadive, which was revived by the folks out of Switzerland who revived the Doxa Synchron brand. And it was actually one of the earlier bronze cases produced. Very high quality. The thing with the bronze cases now is there are some that are coming from not great markets and not great production that are probably a little sketchy. You want to make sure you know what you're buying. These cases in particular are made from the CU SN8, which is a marine grade bronze. Okay. It's very corrosion resistant. It develops a really nice patina to the case. Just a really, really rich color. With bronze like this, you never want to get to the point where you've got green, chunky, crystallized corrosion, because what happens is the bronze reacts with the chlorides, and salt water having sodium chloride, which is salt, you end up with this. Well, actually, sodium chloride is table salt. I don't remember the particular chemical makeup of sea salt, but I'm sure it's pretty similar, if not identical. And what happens is it creates this green crust, which if you leave on the case will result in pitting.
Okay.
And one thing you don't want in a watch is pitting. It makes it look nasty, it makes it less functional, it can ruin the bezel, the crown, the whole 9 yards. So the idea is if you're diving in salt water with a bronze watch, you come out and you rinse it like you do all your gear. I rinse my BC, I rinse my fins and my mask and my wetsuit, and I'm going to rinse my bronze watch.
Yeah, that's all you have to do. You have to rinse it too, because the patina is what people love in a bronze watch.
Exactly.
Bronze patina is like nothing else. We brought a couple examples along. The color of it, it shows age quicker than other watches, but it's beautiful. But I've also seen pictures, I think other people have seen them on Instagram as well, of bronze watches that are just completely crusted, and that's something that somebody went diving with but didn't rinse it off.
Right.
And all you have to do is run it over some water. It's still going to patina. It's still going to get a very nice patina to it, but it's not going to ruin the watch. It's not going to pit it. When we talk about pitting, it's actually holes in the case that at a certain pressure can actually lead to a failure of the case. And when we talk about dive watches, it's your life that's in stake. Because you're actually timing how long you're underwater and how long you can stay underwater. Sure. Which are extremely critical. That's why, like on a Propoff, where it has the rotating bezel that locks, that bezel locks, so you can't by any chance move it. The single rotational bezels turn, so you can't back it up the opposite direction.
So you think you've been underwater for less time,
yep,
correct?
To fool yourself that you could stay under longer than you can. And you actually time the ascents as well, right?
Yeah, you can do a half stop. You can safety stops depending. If you're diving no decompression limits, you're diving recreational diving. Nowadays everybody has a dive computer. I have a dive computer, but I also dive with a wristwatch because you want redundancies in your system.
Absolutely.
So if I have 2 dive lights and 2 dive knives and I carry a spare mask, I'm going to have an extra timing device, and in this case, that's going to be my wristwatch. And as I go down with my dive buddy below the water, I'm going to set the bezel so that it's on the minute hand, and I'm going to know how much time has expired, so I know when I need to come back up.
Very cool, very cool. I'm looking for one in here. Something else that you do, and this is one I was looking for actually. This is one of the pictures that you took as well, and I believe you were actually commissioned for this, weren't you?
Yeah, I did some work for RGM.
Out of Pennsylvania.
Out of Pennsylvania. Roland Murphy, fantastic guy, great company. Roland was extensively trained in Europe and decided to create his own watch brand and did so. And this was one of his divers that they were producing. I took some shots in the Keys. Just a great time, great people to work with. So. And
I think it's a great thing too. I think more brands should do that, and actually have, instead of coming out with all this, the CGI and making the watches look like they're underwater, actually have them perform underwater, because nothing looks as good as a dive watch when it is underwater. I remember the first time I was wearing an old Rolex 5513, and I actually took one. It was just into a pool. The look of the watch underwater just completely transformed with the curved crystal. A curved acrylic crystal, it's like it wasn't even there. It just disappears, and everything just became so visible. It was just one of the coolest things I remember seeing.
And that's one of the differences between an acrylic crystal and a sapphire crystal.
Absolutely.
Underwater, you tilt your sapphire crystal and you try to look at it, and all you see is a big silver blur.
You get a mirror, exactly. And where the sapphire or the acrylic, because of the curvature and everything else, you look at it from different angles, and you could see everything.
Absolutely.
It's very, very cool. I want to talk about, too, we get into diving. You're an underwater archaeologist. So you had a little project that I know you're very proud of, and I want to talk about that for a little bit, too.
Okay.
So I'm just going to hand this one over to you, because I am not going to know the name of this.
Okay, so this is a Hunt Type 2 escort destroyer commissioned 1939 for the British Navy. In 1940, it was transferred to the Polish Navy, which was based in England in absentia because Poland was occupied by the Nazis, obviously. My dad was on this ship from spring of 1942 until it went down in June of 1942.
How did it go down?
It was part of Operation Harpoon. It was approaching Grand Harbor in Malta. It had left Gibraltar as part of a convoy to resupply Malta. Malta at the time was essentially isolated in an Axis lake. It was controlled by Italy and Germany, completely shut off from most aid. And they were escorting 6 freighters from Gibraltar with fuel oil and munitions and food and that type of stuff. So as they entered Grand Harbor in Malta on the approach, about 2.5 miles outside of the harbor, they struck a mine. And actually, one of the ships in the escort, the destroyer escort line, struck a mine before them. They supposedly turned to help that ship and struck a mine as a result of that. The ship went down in 25 minutes. 13 men out of the 160-some crew perished. My dad was in the water for, he said, hours and hours. Whether it was hours and hours, I don't know. My dad died in 2003 before I found the ship. At any rate.
So this ship, as you said, you found the ship. So this ship was actually lost for
73 years.
For 73 years. And you were able to actually find the ship, discover the ship, and raise the bell.
Yeah. And now this was during the course of several years. It didn't all happen.
Right.
And I have to give props to my friend Peter Wodakowski. The group I'm a member of, one of the groups I'm a member of, is the Shipwreck Expedition Association. Peter is a technical diver. He's been on multiple expeditions. They've found all kinds of great shipwrecks over the course of several years. Peter came to me in 2014 as part of a workshop that I was doing for nautical archaeology in Toledo, Ohio. I happened to mention to him my dad was on the ship, and Peter said, "Oh, we'll go find it." And I thought, "Oh yeah, sure you will." September, August, I get an email saying we're going to Malta. We're going to find, we're going to look for your dad's ship. Excellent. So we ended up, they rented a sailboat and they searched for the ship. I believe it was for 10 days. On the 10th day, they had a sonar image of the ship. They sent out an ROV. They sent me some stills. I took the stills, analyzed them, compared them with the blueprints of the ship, and identified it completely as being the wreck of the Kuyaviak, based on eliminating possible identifications, looking at the arrangement of the armament, the portholes, the construction of the superstructure, and the whole nine yards.
It's like a fingerprint.
It's like a fingerprint. Yeah, there's a lot of things you use in archaeology, nautical archaeology, when you look at ships: the provenance, the geographical location, the construction of the ship, the historical record. So we did a lot of that. Now, they did a lot of work beforehand in the archives at Kew in the UK to find the reports from the captains and the other ships that were there at the time. So they did a lot of legwork. It wasn't just finding the ship. 2015 or 2016, they went back. They located the ship's bell. And 2017, this past May, we brought the bell up with the aid of a lot of technical divers, some guys from the UK, from the US, some really great guys.
That is just so cool. I remember when you were going down there and you were going on the expedition to actually pull the bell up, and just, I can't imagine how great that makes you feel to be able to pull, to find something like that. To me, it's the ultimate needle in a haystack.
Yeah, it was amazing, and they had almost given up the year before looking, to find the bell, and it just happened to be at the very last few minutes of the dive. They located it. Peter and my buddy Sharky Alexander located the bell. And
where's the bell now?
The bell's being curated by the University of Malta. We actually had permits. We were working with the university to bring it up. It's not like we dove on the ship and took the bell.
Right.
But it's being curated and preserved. It's probably going to go on tour to Poland and a few other places to go along with the documentary that was made about the ship. That
is very, very cool.
Yeah.
You've got some other stuff coming up too, where you're going to go next. You're looking for submarines. Yeah, this year. B-24s, I believe.
This year we're looking for some bombers in a location I can't tell you about, but we'll just say it's in Europe, and some submarines. One submarine in particular, off the coast of Europe somewhere.
Okay. We got a question that I want to chime in on. John Fitzgibbons. He's curious as to what kind of strap is best for diving, or is it personal preference?
That's a great question. I don't like steel bands for diving.
Yeah, I don't like steel bands for anything.
Yeah, and that comes from a bad experience twice in shallow water diving reefs where I actually had spring bars pop.
Okay.
And
because you don't have the flex.
Yeah, you don't have the flex. Now, if you have an extension, an extension link that you pop out is one thing. I typically, if I'm diving a dry suit in cold water, I typically use an isoframe type rubber band. Put it actually around my dry suit wrist, the wrist of my dry suit, not terribly tight, and that's not a big deal because it doesn't tend to shift a whole lot if it's tight enough. If I'm diving in a shorty like in the Caribbean or South Florida or even Lake Erie in summer, I'll put it right on my skin.
Okay. I
don't recommend a steel band. It's not comfortable. It always seemed to me that rubber is the best choice.
Yeah.
Make sure you get something strong. I have had buddies who dive with NATO straps.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that too, because even we have the Bronzo over here, the Panerai, and that comes with the diving strap, and it's actually it's on a leather strap right here, but it comes with the long NATO or the long NATO strap. It's a long NATO strap to wrap around the wetsuit.
Right, and a NATO strap is great because if one spring bar pops, the watch isn't coming off.
Right.
Because it's still got one more spring bar on the strap.
It's still up. And again, we have to remember, you're wearing this watch as a backup. It's not just, you're not wearing the watch to wear a watch underwater. You're wearing this for a backup, and this could potentially save your life.
Absolutely.
One thing I'd like to demonstrate on that is we talk about on the dive watch. Where are we at? There we are. We have the rotating bezel, and as anyone that's watched Tim over and over again knows, the bezel is only going to rotate one way. And so what you do is you're basically going to set your 12 to where your minutes are. So as the time passes, it's going to show you how much time has passed because it can't go back the other way. So it just gives you a starting reference. And then as you ascend, you can actually move that too, or will you? And that's how I'm asking, will you move that as you ascend, or is it you're going to set that there and just time your dive?
It's going to set and stay there.
Okay.
Typically I'm just doing recreational or shallow water, no decompression dives. And I'm going to set it as soon as I go to ascend or to descend. I'm going to set the bezel. I'm going to drop down. When I get to 2/3 of my air or whatever my plan is for the dive, I start to ascend. I'll look at my dive watch. I'll look at my computer. And I go by my computer, but if something were to happen, the battery were to die, a shark were to eat my computer, which happens every couple of weeks, then I would have the watch as a backup.
We had a question up there about all the shipwrecks around Miami, around Florida. South Florida is a haven for shipwrecks, for treasure seekers. We have the Atocha, which is probably the most famous shipwreck. Mel Fisher. Just how long it took him to find it. He lost his son while he was trying to find it.
And his daughter-in-law, too.
And was it his daughter-in-law, too? Yeah, so. It was just... and then the struggle he went through after he did make the discovery of
fighting with the state.
Who gets the money,
Sure.
Who gets the money. So there is a breakdown if you do find something, depending on if it's on international waters or if it's state waters.
It depends on the state, too.
Okay.
The Shipwreck Protection Act from the 80s actually declares that all abandoned vessels and their belongings in state waters belong to the state. Okay. I know in Lake Erie, for instance, to take anything off a wreck, you have to jump through hoops backwards, sideways till Tuesday. But in Florida, if you have claims on things you found, the state's going to take, I believe it's 25%. Okay. So it's, it's a fairly big chunk, but if you find millions and millions of dollars, 25% of millions of dollars is better than 0% of nothing.
A couple other questions. They're glad they're coming in now. Again, John Fitzgibbons, he asked, with the pressure changes, does the watch need to be tested more often? Yes. The watch should be tested regularly. Seals should be changed. And we were talking about this before the show. I think it's going to be a great segment sometime. I'm actually going to bring in a Lidditz tester or a Roxor 125 tester and do a water pressure test live on the air, so people can actually see how we test the dive watches themselves. We have to test them to 125% of the rated depth. So we're not testing, if the watch is rated at 300 meters, we're not going to 300 meters, we're going past it. So it's a redundant system. We have to be sure. The only way I'm going to test a watch, though, is once all the seals are changed.
Right.
We'll talk about helium valves. The helium valves are, it's a whole different thing where helium molecules are smaller than the air molecules, so they'll actually get into the watch.
For all of our saturation divers, of which I'm sure there are thousands watching right now, the helium escape valve, I believe Rolex came up with it before Doxa. If I'm wrong, please don't send me nasty emails. The idea was that for saturation divers working in a confined environment in a bell between dives at deep depth, and breathing mixed gas, typically with a lot of helium to displace the nitrogen that would otherwise be absorbed by their tissues. Helium's inert. That the molecules of helium would get inside of the watch itself, permeate either around the crystal, through the gaskets, the case back, whatever the case may be, and that as the pressure decreased, those helium molecules trying to get out of the case would pop the crystal out.
Correct.
And destroy the watch. This was solved by automatic helium release valves by a Rolex in 1967, I believe, with the Sea Dweller. Doxa, I believe, shortly thereafter. And then Seiko actually came up with and Omega came up with a great solution. They actually created
positive pressure inside the case.
Well, they created L-shaped gaskets.
Oh, that's right, yes.
That were practically impervious to the helium. So, you know, Seikos get disrespected a lot of time, but a lot of their watches are trend-setting, are rather record-setting. What's the deepest I've dived to? I'm not a technical diver. A lot of my friends are. I'm hoping to get rebreather certified in the next year or two. On air, 140 feet. Not deeper than that.
Okay.
So,
and how long can you stay down when you're on 140 feet?
Not long.
Yeah, it takes longer to come back up than you can stay down, doesn't it?
Yeah, because your tissues are absorbing more nitrogen, and it takes more time to off-gas that nitrogen. I don't think that I've never been at that depth more than about 8 minutes. Okay. Whereas I can be at 110 for about 20 to 25. Right. So. Yeah,
so you're kind of weighing, you know, is it worth it? It's almost the correlation I used to say is when I used to be an airplane mechanic, and I was working on planes when the Learjet, the Lear 25D was rated at 51,000 feet. But you can only stay at 51,000 feet for a short time, and they had to wear oxygen because they were up there, then they come back down. So it ran efficiently, but it was, again, we're talking about 25 years ago.
Gotcha.
We talk about, you know, carbon fiber.
So there's a question about ceramic too.
I see a question about Hublot and the carbon fiber. One of the things about that is the Hublot watch, they actually use a titanium case and a container, they call it. And the watch is actually housed in a titanium container, and then it's covered with carbon plates. So the carbon, whether it's carbon, gold, steel, titanium, they're all pieces of furniture that go on top of the case. And they're screwed together. That's the construction of Hublot. It's a modular design. But inside that entire watch is a titanium case that's very water resistant. So it's not a bad way to go. It's easier for production because they can make different designs around the same base.
I saw an interesting question, or actually one gentleman said that he doesn't think it's the case material that matters, it's the seals. There's a great video about 10 years ago, I think, of Seiko doing a deep water test where they took their Darth tuna, and I forget the other one. Essentially, it's the automatic and their quartz divers, their 1,000 meter divers. They strapped them to the side of a deep water submersible, and they went to a depth of, I want to say, 3,300 meters when they were rated for 1,000 meters.
Okay.
The way that both of these watches stopped, the crystals actually flexed and pinned the hands.
That is the same thing on the Omega. Where the Omega, the original crystal design on this, or the original design on this, the watch is only rated to 600 meters.
It was a mineral crystal originally.
It was a mineral crystal, but it wasn't the crystal that was the problem. The crystal actually sits on top of, originally it was a plastic ring. And the ring would actually compress under the pressure, and the crystal would stop the second hand because it compressed. When I redid this watch, I actually replaced that ring, and it's a metal ring that's inside there. So for all intents and purposes, we don't have a helium valve in here, but because of the construction of the prop-off, the crystal actually has a nut that goes on top of it and screws down. So even if anything would get inside of it, there's no place for it to escape. So that's one of the different things. And the deep sea dweller, the deep sea, Rolex deep sea, actually came up with the same idea where the crystal actually sits on top of a metal ring to stop it from compressing into the movement. There's a ring inside of the housing.
Is that the ring that says Rolex, Rolex,
that's
Rolex,
the one.
Rolex?
That's the one where it says Rolex deep sea. But it's just a floating ring that's inside there, and the crystal actually sits on top of that ring, and it physically stops it from compressing into the movement. But again, we have a helium escape valve in that watch as well.
Another thing about the Rolex, the Ploprof, is that the fact that it was also tested, evaluated, and used by Comex. It's a Monaco case design. So there's only two places for ingress or egress of water, either through the crown or through the seals around the crystal.
Yeah, when we talk about that, as I could show you right here, okay, underneath the bezel here is a nut that holds it down. We have the crown, of course, on the side. It has a lockdown, has a screw-down lock, but there's no case back. So everything, there is actually no opening whatsoever in the case back, so everything is actually loaded before the crystal's loaded. And then when the nut goes down, it can't go anywhere. It's just, it's really trapped down in there.
And you know, and that's a feature that was actually put on some of the earlier pocket watches that were rated as being water resistant or dust resistant. I think the first major manufacturer to use a Monaco case was Seiko.
Okay.
I believe it was Seiko, I'm not 100% sure. And they still manufacture.
Well, even look at the old Omega Seamasters. You know, they were a Monaco case. The original ones.
You needed a vacuum to remove the crystal.
Yeah, you pop it out and everything. It was very cool. Yeah. I want to go through a couple of your quick pictures real quick.
Sure.
And if we can. And this is just one of my favorites. I've got an amazing picture of a turtle, and I know from St. Thomas, and I know you got this one. Where'd you shoot this one at?
I shot this last week.
Did you?
A couple days before you arrived down to visit me. This was on the wreck of the Eagle, which is actually an artificial reef off of Isla Mirada, Florida, which was changed drastically by Hurricane Irma. But yeah, that's a little turtle.
That's very, very cool. How deep is this?
That's 100 feet, maybe.
Okay. That's quite a bit down there. Yeah. See, the one thing, again, never diving, to me, I would have to get used to the pressures on your entire body. You know, it's just that feel. How do you not, you know, the claustrophobia, I think, is what...
I've never been claustrophobic diving. I can tell you the problems I've had is never eat a Subway sandwich with extra onions before you go diving.
I'll try to remember that.
And all the divers are going to be posting comments saying that, yeah, they know exactly what I'm talking about, so...
And we got a great picture here.
That's some great barracuda and a guy that decided he was going to descend to the wreck without using the down line. There was no current that day. I think that's on the Duane, which is another artificial reef shipwreck in the Keys.
Well, again, it's just a lot of fun.
You should show the picture of Lake Erie so they can see the difference.
Yeah, and we talked about that. We talked about the cold temperatures, Lake Erie, and just how Lake Erie is protected. This picture here,
Lake Erie divers. There you go.
You can see a little bit of a difference. So you got a flashlight there.
That's a hell of a flashlight. That's like 3,000 lumens, and that's actually on the wreck of the brig Sultan that was discovered in about 2012 by my buddies with Cleveland Underwater Explorers, and then my organization, MAST, surveyed the wreck, and we published a technical report in 2014 that came out. So it's pretty neat. It's on the web.
How deep is that? Lake Erie is not very deep.
No, this is a super shallow dive. You can actually dive this wreck at 45 feet in the summer with a 3mm shorty, and that's what I use to dive it. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful wreck.
Yeah, very cool, very cool. I know there's what, hundreds, thousands of wrecks in the Great Lakes.
And, well, in Lake Erie in particular because it's so shallow,
yeah.
And that the weather can whip up so fast, and you just get shut down if you're out there. You can actually dive in Lake Erie. It looks cold. It is cold. I see the comment. You can actually dive in Lake Erie, go down for your dive. 30 minutes later, you come up, the weather's changed completely. It's gone from glass flat to 4 to 6 foot swells. It can happen that fast. And that's my friend Green Moray on, I forget which wreck I dove last week that he was on, but
that was from last week too.
This shot is hysterical. I'm actually looking straight up in the air.
Really?
So I saw the eel's tail come out of the side of this superstructure portion, and I literally swam underneath, rolled upside down, and shot straight up to get this picture of him. He was looking straight down.
I want to address a question real quick. Andrew Holt, he has Rolex GMT Master 2. Brand new watch, and it's running fast, under a 5-year warranty. They put a weaker mainspring in to regulate it. I'm kind of curious about that. The movement has slight, I actually can't read that for a second. I'll be able to. A slightly high action. By that, I'm assuming he's meaning the amplitude is high. And by the amplitude being high, that's why they would put a weaker mainspring in, because Rolex actually wants to bring the amplitude down. You know, as we talked about before, Rolex runs, they want a smaller gap between your high amplitude and your 24-hour. They don't want that big gap that ETA allows. That's probably one of the reasons they put a weaker mainspring in. I'm surprised they couldn't get that watch regulated to you better. What I was always able to do as a watchmaker, do a more personal thing, and because Chris will wear a watch different than I'll wear a watch, and I can regulate that watch to you, I can regulate that watch to myself. They're going to regulate it to within specs. Your Rolex specs are going to be anywhere from -2 to +4 seconds, but that's on a machine that's not on everyday wearing. My advice is find out in what position the watch is running fast or slow, because you can get a readout, find out what position. You have 6 different positions the watch could be in, and if you want to slow that watch down or speed it up, if you let it rest at night in one position, that's what you'll use to actually speed the watch up or slow it down. They actually use this technique not only in the Accutrons, which had a built-in slow rate, and they had a built-in slow rate and a fast rate, but they also used it. I saw a vintage Rolex operating manual very recently from the 50s for a GMT Master 2, ironically enough, and it's explained exactly what to do, and it told you what position to leave the watch in if you wanted to slow it down or speed it up. So that's one of the things you can do. It's one of the little tricks you can get around to without having to stop the watch all the time. Know your watch, know how it runs, know if it runs faster or slower. And you can use that to keep your watch regulated. Between that and an atomic clock, it makes it very easy. I know we ran a little over, but I think we had a great show. I enjoyed having Chris with me. We talked about this show last week when I was down in the Keys with him.
I got another 40 minutes, but I guess I'm out of time. So.
We talked about this.
I'll come back.
So, yeah, I think we'll try to do something like this again. I want to try to get in the water with you and get some shots. And I want to thank you for coming in. You made the drive into Cleveland, or from Cleveland, with all the weather today. So, I want to thank everybody else for sticking around. I want to thank everybody for watching. Again, send in your ideas, send in your comments, and we'll do our best to talk about those. I want to get back into the watchmaking, but it's always good to have a guest on from time to time as well.
Great to be here.
Yeah. And
cheers.
Thank you. And we're out.